The wager is before us. Christianity, according to an anonymous blogger as James is Cox, is essentially a plagiarism of religions predating even those of Greece and Rome. Indeed, if one is willing to examine Christianity and paganism with an open mind, such an individual will find striking similarities between Christian and pagan views. For example, with regard to life after death. For an instance, where Christians have commemorated the triumph of Christ over death, pagans memorialize the power over death manifested by pagan divinities such as Bacchus in Greek mythology and Dionysus in Roman mythology, or folklore, either way, within their inherited resurrection stories. Also, just as a considerable number of Christians have acknowledged a plurality of realms in which to abide after life and have described them in certain ways, so a great deal of pagans have professed belief in a plurality of similar environments and have described them using similar terminology. Are such similarities between Christianity and paganism merely random and accidental? Or is there a purpose behind it all? And if many similarities exist between Christianity and paganism, would such similarities mean that Christianity is an offshoot of paganism? To explore these issues further, it would be beneficial to compare and contrast Christian and pagan views concerning such afterlife realms. To demonstrate generally that secular and sacred literature similarly express belief in an afterlife, consider the following story from Virgil's Aeneid involving Aeneas and the subsequent sacred story involving Saint John. After locating the eternal whereabouts of Anchises, that is, Aeneas' recently deceased father, Aeneas finally meets up with him. Following their happy reunion, Anchises, unexpectedly taking on the roles of prophet, poet, and teacher, foretells the grand fate of his son Aeneas and their joint Italian posterity. Similarly, after Christ's death, and sometime after being exiled to Patmos because of his steadfast devotion to the Christ, John was permitted to see a glorified manifestation of Jesus. Following the heartwarming reunion of John and Jesus, this exalted appearance of Jesus results in John's proclamation in the book of Revelation of a grand message of hope about the ultimate future of God's chosen people. To more specifically establish that life after death was a common notion, also consider the following stories, one from Homer's Iliad involving Odysseus, and the other from 1 Samuel involving King Saul. Shortly after having spent a great deal of energy in the attempt to sail safely over to Cimmerian land, Odysseus, wishing to honor the advice of the Greek goddess Circe, and expecting further guidance from the ancient blind prophet of Apollo, summoned up and conversed with the spirit of Tiresias. Likewise, just after having made his best attempt to travel safely and swiftly and stealthily from the mountains of Gilboa to the Canaanite city of Endor, King Saul, thirsting intellectually for an answer from the Lord concerning his inquiries about defeating the daunting Philistines, was helped by a secular medium to summon up and briefly dialogue with the spirit of the recently deceased prophet Samuel. Hence, where the stories concerning Aeneas and Anchises, John, and Jesus contain messages of hope for the future to living men from characters who have died, the accounts regarding Saul, Samuel, and Odysseus assume that there is some accessible and tangible manner of existence after death. Though secular literature presents an incredibly complex afterlife picture, Greeks and Romans essentially believed in three afterlife habitats: Hades, Tartarus, and Elysium. The ancient Greeks pictured the world as a large multi-tiered oval being cut in half by the earth, then perceived as flat. Though, over the course of time, secular descriptions of these three afterlife habitats were continually subject to modification, both Greeks and Romans were convinced that the house of Hades was a dark universe in which shadowy ghosts roamed about, and that Tartarus served as the prison to which the Titan gods were confined. For instance, within his epic poem on the war between Troy and Achaia, the Greek poet Homer presented Zeus as delivering an exhortation to the Olympian deities surrounding him against picking sides to aid in the ensuing combat. Near the conclusion of his warning, Zeus decreed his final and most unpleasant consequence for the actions of rebel deities. Here, Zeus vowed that he would personally snatch and hurl traitorous deities down to the murk of Tartarus, half the world away. Further, if the very mention of Tartarus was not enough to instill terror within his divine subjects, Zeus described Tartarus as being the deepest gulf that yawns beneath the ground, where the iron gates and brazen threshold loom, and as far below the house of death as the sky rides over the earth. Thus, as it concerns early Greco-Roman thought pertaining to Hades and Tartarus, Mediterranean natives considered the area to which reprobate gods and persons went as immensely different from the domain to which went the great majority of fleshless spirits. Concerning views presented in secular literature about the afterlife half-caste commonly known as Hades and Tartarus, consider the myth of as recollected by the Greek philosopher Plato. In Plato's account of this pre-Homeric myth, the bold Pamphylian warrior essentially describes Hades as the realm to which unjust men go. Concerning his experience, explains that there were two categories of unjust men, namely the incurable and the curable. Where the curable souls were only temporarily sentenced to abide within Hades, the incurable souls, by contrast, were sentenced to abide in Hades permanently. By being bound hand and foot and head and flung down and flayed and dragged by the wayside, by being carted on thorns and by being made examples to bodiless passers-by for what cause they were borne away. Both curable and incurable souls who tried to escape would be hurled into Tartarus. Regarding both categories of unjust souls who would experience Hades, though it is true that related that every soul sentenced to Hades was required to undergo dreadful suffering, 10 times the penalty for every wrong a soul had ever committed in life, one does receive the impression that the suffering of incurably unjust beings within Tartarus would be far worse than that of the incurably unrighteous. Centuries after the account of was thought to have taken place, Plato, recalling the portions within Homer's epic poems which attempted to portray life after death, observed that powerful and wealthy kings and princes were representatives of what it meant to undergo eternal punishment in Tartarus. In a similarly astute way, Plato noticed it seemed that no writer treating on the afterlife had represented private individuals who had committed great wrongs in life as being afflicted with cruel punishment because they were incurable. Instead, such persons were portrayed as receiving punishment so that they might be cured of their imperfections. So, according to Plato, it would seem that Homer, for example, believed in the same two categories of unjust men as were presented within the account of Moreover, Plato also placed colossal trust in the distinction his philosophic predecessors made between Tartarus and Hades. For instance, Plato suggested that while those who have been guilty of the most heinous crimes are past cure, and while such individuals are no longer capable themselves of receiving any benefit from undergoing suffering, others are benefited who behold them suffering through eternity the greatest and most excruciating and terrifying tortures because of their misdeeds, literally suspended as examples in the prison house in Hades. Though Plato thought it important to stress that there are beings whose evil deeds are curable, he still made sure to strongly suggest that it is from pain and agony that such individuals derive their benefit both here and in the other world. Thus, according to Plato, without suffering, it is impossible to be rid of evil. Therefore, one can quite safely assume that for a considerable number of centuries before and after Homer, Mediterranean natives had believed there was a tremendous difference between Hades and Tartarus. Now, late in Greco-Roman history, inhabitants of Greece and Rome came to believe in a new subterranean environment, afterlife habitat, named after the river Lethe in Hades, within which the virtuous could hope to dwell, among magnificent meadows. While it is curious that certain contemporaries of Homer placed heroic figures in a sublime realm, where Homer chose instead to place his heroes in the ordinary domain of Hades, post-Homeric residents of Greece and Rome went on to combine the realm of heroes with that of virtuous men into a tangible, blissful realm, now moved above the underworld, called the Elysian Fields. Just as late writers in the Greco-Roman tradition were accustomed to blending together the notions of the realm of the dead, a prison for reprobate persons, and a place of torment for the Titan gods, so it was that Mediterraneans came to conceive of a combined dwelling place for both virtuous men and heroes. So, though late secular writers were accustomed to blending together the notion of Hades with Tartarus and the notion of Lethean fields with Elysian fields, early secular thinkers were persuaded that there was a tremendous difference between the horror-inducing Tartarus, the awe-inspiring Elysium, and the relaxed state of existence found in Hades. When compared to the view which pagans held concerning the nature of the universe, it might come as a shock to some Christians that sacred sages have, until quite recently, pictured the cosmos in essentially the same way as the pagans. That is to say, while people of the 16th century generally came to believe that the sun was the center of the universe, and while people of the 20th century generally came to be convinced that the universe had no center, the ancient Hebrews of Mesopotamia believed that the earth was the center of a three-tiered universe. As viewed by the Hebrews of the Old Covenant age, earth was a disk surrounded by an encompassing sea, held up by enormous pillars. Below the earth, the Hebrews thought a watery abyss laid on top of a world underground. Further, this subterranean realm, designated Sheol, was divided into two sections. The lowest part was called Gehenna, and the highest part was called Paradise. Above the first heaven of the atmosphere, Hebrews believed that a domed firmament, held up by the aforementioned enormous pillars, prevented celestial seawater from falling to the earth below. Since the earth was viewed to be the center of the universe, the Hebrews thought that the succeeding planetary heaven, attached to the firmament and containing the sun, the moon, and the stars, revolved around the earth. Moreover, within his residence in the third heaven, God was believed to preside over the affairs of men on a throne atop the aforementioned celestial sea. Thus, until the arrival of the 16th century of the risen Christ, most, if not all, followers of God had pictured the universe in much the same layered, geocentric or earth-centric way as did the pagans. While sacred descriptions of afterlife habitats were continually subject to modification, the Hebrews generally believed that a great many spirits, having come from diverse walks of life, were appointed to dwell in a deep and dusty environment called Sheol. Throughout their history, most Hebrews believed that Sheol, an environment where the supremacy of silence ousted out all praise of God, had several entrances, which could be located at various visible geographic locations. As well, Hebrews believed that Sheol was divided into a number of vertical compartments. Further, as Sheol was thought to be exceptional in terms of its disorderly nature and dreary enclaves, and insofar as the inhabitants, normally oblivious to human affairs, were thought to be conscious of the realm's dingy state, it comes as somewhat of a relief that the inhabitants were pictured as being prone to find solace in sleep. So that's good. Later on in history, Jews conceptually linked Sheol with the pagan notion of Hades. For instance, where the pious poet David prophesied that the soul of the beloved one would not be left among the dead in Sheol, the blessed St. Peter proclaimed that the soul of the Christ was not lost in Hades. Hence, sacred scholars would seem to agree with pagan philosophers that there is an afterlife realm within which a majority of spirits can congregate after death. Though the consensus of Hebrews regarding the location of the incredibly large Gehenna was not unanimous, the majority believed that this realm was divided into 7 compartments and positioned in the deepest parts of the flat earth. Believing that smoke inexhaustibly rose up through what they thought to be Gehenna's main gate, many Hebrews reasoned that there must have been a great supply of wood underground which fueled an exceedingly hot fire. An inferno at least 60 times hotter than any fire to be found on earth. Moreover, as Gehenna was believed to be an incredibly dark environment where God punished traitorous spirits, it was thought that the prisoners, though already submerged in Gehenna's atrocious odors, were sentenced to continually experience a cascade of fire fall upon their heads and glowing molten metal flow underneath their feet. Later on in history, the Jews conceptually associated Gehenna with the pagan notion of Tartarus. Reflecting on the period just before the Holy Scriptures tell the story of the deluge, virtually all followers of God believed that a number of angels married and had sexual relations with beautiful human women. Further, where pagans conceived of primordial deities giving birth to Titan divinities, it was believed by sacred academics that aforementioned angels and women gave birth to an incredibly famous race of giant hybrid heroes. Centuries later, St. Peter reminded his audience that God didn't spare angels when they sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus and committed them to pits of darkness. Likewise, St. Jude related that God has kept the rebellious heavenly messengers bound and chained in utter darkness, shadowy gloom, until the time when his judgment arrives, because they failed to keep their rightful positions and abandoned their appointed realms. Thus, sacred savants would seem to agree with pagan theorists that a hellish afterlife realm currently exists for spirits who show no remorse for their iniquities. During the first century before Christ's birth, Jews increasingly came to believe in a realm distinct from the third heaven and the prison of Gehenna, Tartarus. Namely, a joyous abode of joy, usually located in the highest part of Sheol, Hades, for a multitude of righteous spirits. As pagan intellectuals associated Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus with afterlife judgment in Hades, so the Jews initially thought that the first man, Adam, presided over the entrances to the prison and paradise partitions of hell. Later on, retaining the same essential notion, the Jews became convinced that it was actually Abraham who fulfilled the role of an afterlife warden. Thus, within St. Luke's Gospel account, Christ told a memorable story concerning the afterlife environment commonly known as the bosom of Abraham. The tale commences with the deaths of 2 characters. The first was Lazarus, a beggar whose existence was filled with a plethora of unpleasant conditions. The second figure though anonymous, was a wealthy individual whose time on earth was, relatively speaking, immensely pleasant. Unfortunately, the latter figure went on to experience a highly unpleasant state of existence in Gehenna. Seeing Lazarus from his place in hell's prison, the tormented rich man shouted to Abraham twice. The first time, asking if Lazarus could be sent over to cool his scorched tongue with even just a drop of water. The second time, requesting for Lazarus to return to earthly life so as to warn his 5 brothers to lead a better life. Though little was said about the former figure Lazarus, it was said that he proceeded to experience an incomprehensibly pleasant state of existence in the paradise of Abraham's bosom. Further, even though little was said regarding the higher and lower realms of Sheol Hades, it was related that an imposing chasm separated the anonymous rich man from Lazarus. Therefore, sacred and pagan scholars have agreed in the existence of an afterlife realm in between the unfathomably happy habitat of the third heaven and the profoundly gloomy environment of Gehenna. Working with the premise that Christ descended into Sheol to extract righteous Old Covenant spirits from Abraham's bosom and bring them into the third heaven, a considerable number of Christians since medieval times have come to believe in the existence and operation of a substitutionary afterlife environment, namely purgatory. For instance, St. Catherine of Siena, a 14th century Italian philosopher and theologian, describes purgatory as a realm filled to the brim with the burning love of God, in whose flames saints are purified from every stain, so that they might be ready to enter the presence of God, their most sweet love. Convinced in the existence of a realm strict to purge right loves from reprobate, St. Dante Alighieri, the 13th century Italian poet, described the post-bosom intermediate afterlife environment as a habitat where human spirits were sent to purge themselves and trained to leap into joy celestial. 8 centuries earlier, within his work in praise of the city of God against the pagans, St. Augustine, a Christian theologian and philosopher, argued that there are a variety of punishments which last temporarily and a variety of punishments which last eternally. Though temporary punishments are said to occur before that last and strictest judgment, St. Augustine wrote that they are suffered by some in this life only, by others after death, and by others both now and then. Concerning all disciples of God, working with the premise that all are not doomed to those everlasting pains which are to follow that final judgment, St. Augustine believed that there are certain individuals of the faith who are not punished with the eternal punishments of the world to come, because what is not remitted in this world is remitted in the next. 5 centuries earlier, as it is recorded within St. Matthew's Gospel account, Jesus the Christ declared that though whoever speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven in this life or the life to come. Hence, in that there is a sin so severely significant that guilty parties can find no forgiveness in this life or the life to come, one can argue that there is a period before the final judgment and yet after the conclusion of this life wherein the guilt of individuals for sins committed may be removed. Though Christendom has experienced a paradigm shift away from Abraham's bosom as an intermediate afterlife environment, a multitude of Christians continuing to believe in an afterlife environment distinct from Gehenna and the third heaven have deemed it good to call this period wherein sanctification may take place by the title purgatory. Therefore, just as many pagan intellectuals believed in a realm where sin-sick spirits could undergo purification, so many Christian intellectuals have believed in a realm where souls could continue their journey of being sanctified by the aid of God before entering the third heaven. Thus, secular authorities such as Homer, and Plato, as well as sacred thinkers Luke, Augustine, Dante, and Catherine, agree that 3 afterlife habitats have existed. A beautiful environment within which dwell divinity and select saints, a gloomy realm within which dwell reprobate creatures, and some domain functioning as the median between the 2 afterlife habitat extremities. When faced with the reality that Christendom has propagated afterlife doctrines containing elements in common with a myriad of pagan views regarding life after death, certain Christians might find themselves becoming disconcerted with regard to the validity of their faith. They may assume that Christianity contains only doctrines which are absolutely pure and true and positively good for the well-being of humanity. They may also assume that all past and present non-Christian religions only contain doctrines which are obviously false and clearly bad for the welfare of society. If presented with proof that Christianity has similarities to non-Christian religions, some such Christians might fear that Christianity must surely be a paradigm of thought which is erroneous and unacceptable for the prosperity of humanity. Granting that the creeds of Christendom have similarities to the principles of paganism, must Christians abandon their faith as if it were a sinking ship? If it can be agreed that cold is the absence of heat, and darkness the absence of light, it would likewise seem that evil is the absence of good. Also, if it can be agreed that creatures exist insofar as they dependently share in the presence of their Creator, it would similarly appear to be the case that evil exists only insofar as it parasitically shares in the presence of good. If then it can be agreed that God was only responsible for creating good, and if it can be agreed that evil is like a moldy version of good, evil is not the polar opposite of good. So, if non-Christian religions cannot be polar opposites to truth and goodness, they can only be false and bad relative to that which is true and good. Therefore, whether considered in general terms, or whether specific afterlife doctrines are concerned, Christianity will only differ at specific points from the religions and doctrines of pagans. Such pagan religions likely even whisper hints and clues about truth and goodness. If the center of our life is a certain fact, said the essayist G.K. Chesterton, would not people far from the center have a muddled version of that fact? The philologist J.R.R. Tolkien and later the medievalist C.S. Lewis came to a similar conclusion. Grounded in the assumption that myths conveyed joy-generating meaning and beauty, where history spawns melancholy-inducing insignificant and unattractive truths, C.S. Lewis had initially resigned to the conclusion that boring truths were the victors in a war against wonderful myths. Upon learning Lewis's notion that intellectual truths and imaginative myths were incompatible, Tolkien responded that if myths come from the imagination of brilliant men, and if humans come from the imagination of a good God, humans cannot ultimately be liars, and myths cannot ultimately be lies. Instead, humans are fundamentally lovers of truth, and myths are essentially convenient vehicles through which countless abstract universal truths may be conveyed. Accordingly, where pagan myths vaguely expressed the general yearning of mankind for the uniting of divinity with humanity, Christian truths express with clarity the specific circumstances encompassing the descent and ascension of that magnificent desire of ages, not the fire. Now, since there is no perfect way to prove that Christianity is the truest myth, the rational faculties and aspirations for happiness belonging to the human race are indeed at stake. One and all must fixer tin tapanim, that is in English, count the cost. As individuals must decide whether to accept or deny the common notions of Euclid before proceeding with his system of geometry, humans must eventually decide whether they shall embrace or dismiss Christianity before continuing on with their lives. Though they lose nothing should they lose the bet, they win everything should they win the wager. One may recall that when C.S. Lewis's character Puddleglum made the decision to stand by the play world, Puddleglum would discover that his fantasy world had always been more authentic than the evil witch's supposedly real world. Therefore, should they wager in favor of the sacred gospel and its grand picture of life after death, humans may similarly discover that the wondrous myth of Christianity has all along been the craft more worthy to sail the infinite seas of truth than all other religious myths which this world will ever recognize.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scrivner. You've, in your paper, done something which is a little rare for ETS students. Rather than being vague and philosophical, you've been highly specific and given us a lot of very interesting historical detail on your main premise, which is the elements in paganism that are similar to ideas we have in Christianity. And your basic position seems to be that this does not mean that Christianity is just a pagan copy or pagan plagiarism, you might say, but that the pagan myths were precursors to Christianity and illuminating the truth of Christianity. Well, and so something existing in paganism as an idea does not seem to be an argument against its truth or an argument against Christianity, but simply evidence for the universal, what you might call mythical nature of Christianity, having being something that's not just true, but also something that expresses truths that many have seen and thought. Having said that, you bring up the number of incidences in paganism where we find a third realm in the afterlife, a sort of mediating realm, as Plato describes in the Gorgias, a sphere in which those who have not attained sufficient righteousness to approach God can have remediation in righteousness that they might enter into God's presence. Given the number of pagan sources for this kind of intermediate state, something like purgatory, do you think that is actually an argument for Christians' current belief in purgatory?
Well, now before I address the question, I know it's a touchy issue, and so I just want to let you all know that I believe in heaven and hell, and in this paper I'm not necessarily trying to argue that it is in fact a big certainty that there is an intermediate realm. I'm just trying to report what I've seen. Sacred and secular people have believed in this other realm. And there seems to be enough good reason to kind of go there, at least in speculation. But to get to your question, let's see, what's a good way to begin talking about that? I guess in short, I don't feel uncomfortable thinking that pagan thoughts regarding an intermediate afterlife realm
are necessarily completely untrue and false. I'm not uncomfortable thinking that there is probably such a realm, even though I'm not completely sure about it. But let's see, what's a better way to approach this? I guess the main reason why I would tend to think that the pagan myths regarding several, or at least one intermediate place, seem to make sense and seem to support a Christian version of it. I would tend to think so because there are so many other parallels which exist in paganism and Christianity, which Christians accept on a daily basis. Like, for example, let's see. Okay, just on a surface level, in the New Testament, for example, we don't really have a manual of how to worship exactly, or it's nothing like Leviticus in the Old Testament. So, like, for example, we hear about disciples meeting in people's homes or that sort of thing, and then later on in Christianity we have this whole thing about having buildings to worship in, and then some Christians have been worried about this and have looked back and said, well, hey, pagans had temples of their own and whatnot, and shouldn't we be frightened about that? Shouldn't we try to revert to this old, not revert, but go back to this old system of meeting in homes or something like that? But that's just one example, places of worship. Another example, when it comes to Jesus Christ, when you really delve into it, there are lots of similarities to be noted between him and several other pagan divinities and how they were described over the course of time. Like, for example, in addition to saying that Jesus is the Son of God, we also say he is like the planetary sun of our lives. And that imagery of the sun is also something which pagans themselves used for many of their gods. Many more examples could be cited, but I think this is where Paul's, in one of his epistles, St. Paul says something about how the job of the Christian is to captivate those thoughts belonging to the world, well, in the world, but really belong to Jesus Christ in reality, to take them and bring them back to where they belong, under the rulership of God. So I think, at least working under that premise of St. Paul and working under the assumption that there are so many similarities that there are between paganism and Christianity, I would tend to think that it doesn't seem entirely unreasonable to go there and say that there perhaps is an intermediate afterlife realm. It kind of seems to make sense when you take the wide, big scope of things, I guess.
All right. The influence of pagan imagery on Christian thought is curious. Even the idea of crossing a river in order to get to heaven. It's in part of Pilgrim's Progress, but nowhere in the Bible do we cross a river when we die. But in paganism, we cross the river Styx. And so even the imagery of crossing the river on the point of death is something we seem to have kind of pulled into popular Christian imagery at least. Yet, are we going to come to a better Christianity by embracing pagan imagery and incorporating it into the faith? You might say it's kind of taking captive every thought for Christ. Or do we come to a better vision of the faith by purging it of pagan influences? And, as perhaps Luther you might see as kind of purging Christianity of this notion of the third state, purgatory. So, should we look to purifying our theology either by finding ways to reject those things that are inherently pagan, or finding ways to somehow embrace them and incorporate them in a Christian fashion?
That is also a very difficult question, and whatever answer I give is only like a grain in the sand of everybody else's thoughts. So I really don't matter that much. But anyway.
But right now you do, because you're the one answering.
That's true. Okay, well, I just need to put that statement into humility. But, okay, I think we've had a similar discussion theme within several of my colleagues' papers in the last few days. And I think the basic thing to keep in mind here is, like it was said a few days ago, I forget by whom, but the very purpose of things as they are supposed to be. Like, for example, the human body, for example, Plato, many of you GBT1ers are getting more familiar with it, many of you GBT3ers and GBT5ers have a good concept of this, but Plato thought that Plato and Socrates thought that that we have a material part of our bodies is something like a prison. It's like we're birds trapped in a cage. And some Christians have gotten to thinking that way, but it kind of, I'm going to be picky, but it kind of seems like that kind of thought isn't echoed exactly in Scripture, so I'm going to go with this other thought, that the body, as God intended it, is quite holy, and it is good, fundamentally. And so, when it comes to evil or bad things that are done with the human body, that does not mean that the human body is evil or bad inherently within itself or in its original function. So we have to kind of, we have to, I think, remember that the way God intended things like the human body or other material objects is good fundamentally. And if that assumption is acceptable, that a lot of the things we see were meant to be good, then, well, I tend to think that what we need to do is, if we see something material or some thought or something of the sort, word or deed, that's not according to a good purpose, and if we know that it can also be converted to a good purpose, we need to take that, the misused things and not be afraid to bring them back and transform them to what they are supposed to be. That was just another example, but I guess it kind of works along the same lines as my previous answer. But the basic assumption, take it or leave it, is if God meant for blank to be good, then we're supposed to kind of remain and keep in that vision, stew ourselves in, brew ourselves in that vision, and be good stewards of the world that God has given us, so that we are not ashamed to present the world as it should be and as it really is. And that also applies an extension to an idea of an intermediate afterlife state. So I would say it would be an enhanced version.
The answer to your question does seem to be very difficult. However, it seems obvious that the only reason you have this question is because you've read lots of ancient literature, and so the comparisons come up as they question your mind. If this question cannot be easily answered, would not the best answer then be to simply put yourself in a state where the question does not come up, not reading the great books?
That indeed is a lovely question, Rich. It brings pain to my heart, but okay, I'll try to go with it. Ultimately, well, it's a tough question to answer, but in an ideal state, we wouldn't have evil or bad thoughts to worry about. So yes, good thoughts and good things, we should always be trying to think about those. And as the scriptures say, we should be babes to evil and more knowledgeable of what is good. However, the difficulty is that we do live in a very sinful world, and some have tried to live in denial of the world that we live in, and it kind of makes for a tough existence, just let's say, because it brings a lot of disappointments no matter where you go. Now, when it comes to approaching the great books specifically, I'm inclined to think that if you have Christians who are just coming into the faith, or they have what we might call weak consciences, but I don't know how exactly to describe that or delineate it. No matter what, if you have those with a sort of a weaker version of a strong faith, then I think for them it is perhaps the best thing not to go digging into those different sources. But if you have an adventurous Christian, then it's perhaps one of the best things they can do to familiarize themselves with everything they can see in the world, just so that they can engage the world and captivate those thoughts for Christ and all the above sort of thing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scrivner. Other questions?
Okay, let's see. Chloe?
Okay, so I was just going to ask you, does the need for purgatory invalidate the total, complete sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross? Does the need?
Right, I get where you're going. And that is also a very touchy issue. I'm conscious of that. Here's a way to think about it that I think might be helpful. As a Christian, one might say that, well, Christ's work has technically been done since the beginning of creation. Because if God foreknew that all the stuff we have would happen, and if he shows that Christ would come ahead of time, and if he could see everything far in advance without, necessarily dictating everybody's human will. If you think of it in that way, then yes, Christ's work is very complete. It's been complete since the beginning of creation. It's been complete just a second ago. It's going to be even more complete in the future. It's complete in that sense. But at the same time, when it comes to salvation, we have a curious picture represented within Scripture of kind of salvation being spoken of in three tenses. We've got, I have been saved by grace through faith. I am being saved because I'm following Christ and I'm loving him and I'm working with him. This isn't, I'm not talking about a gospel of works and getting it by yourself, but there's a sense in which obedience does take a very important role. And that's where that plays in. And then you have, I hope to be saved. So in that sense, salvation, in a sense, in that I have sin right now. I'm a very sinful person. Even though Christ has, I believe, redeemed me, that battle is not, in this sense, over. So as long as we're sticking to this sense of salvation being in three different tenses, then I think, at least I imagine by the time that I die, I'm not going to be perfectly absolved of every wrong. I'm still going to be quite guilty of a lot. But there is perhaps reason to think that if there is a hope to be saved completely, then if I don't die completely saved, then there's some sort of gap. And we all debate about what exactly the gap means, how quickly it happens, what exactly goes on. But I think, at least historically, people have looked at this and called it purgatory. To my ears, it would work better if I called it sanctificatory or something like that. But, it's a tricky question, but I guess my answer is Christ's work is complete in one sense, but not so complete in another, but that doesn't mean it negates this other sense.
But since God is outside of time, doesn't that mean that all of his work is already done in all the senses, because time doesn't apply to him like in the future or in the past, like God's already finished it. So when we die, couldn't we say since he's outside of time, that finished work in us is already done by the time that we die, because God is outside of time? Like this life is more like the sanctificatory that we're going through, and when we get there, God's already completed it because he's already done all that work in, I don't want to say in his own timing because he's not in time, but in his own way before we get there.
I see where you're going. Yeah, I guess I like your vision and the picture of God being outside of time and things being complete in that sense. In that sense, really, I totally agree. Like this lifetime that we're in is like a blip, and then there's going to be living with God for eternity, even though it seems like forever to us. But yeah, in a sense, we do, like Augustine was saying, we do go through a series of purgation here. We do go through a series of sanctification here, and I totally agree with you with that. But I guess in my mind, in the funky way that I think, it would seem to be like you could still theoretically at least have a quick meshed gap between our existence here and some other place where God does cool stuff, sanctifies us.
And I just wanted to say your paper was beautifully written and it was very fascinating, so I really enjoyed it.
Cool. Hope I gave sufficient.
Yeah, it was good.
Yes, Olivia.
Right. Yeah. Very, very tough topic to tackle. Thank you for that, and the presentation was very captivating. So, I want to talk about. You made a lot of connections between a lot of pagan beliefs and even Old Testament beliefs in an afterlife and punishment in afterlife, especially in paganism. And we see in a lot of myths in other beliefs and other cultures that seem to have some correlations between what we believe happened in the Bible. Like there are a lot of Chinese stories and fables about there being a worldwide flood, as we see in the story of Noah also. And C.S. Lewis, as the Thinking God and Dog, as he's talked about pagans being more ripe for conversion than atheists because they have a belief in a God, in some sort of deity. But you talked about in your paper a lot about their belief in also punishment for sin in an afterlife. So as you're talking about with Mr. H earlier, it seems that it's good for us to tackle these great books as Christians. But how would you, I guess, because would you agree that just as we don't get to heaven through good works, we don't go to hell through bad ones? It's a matter of belief, simply?
No, that in itself is a whole other plethora of papers right there. But yes, in essence, I'd go with that statement because I believe that a guy like Paul can be saved. No matter how much wrong you do, save the unforgivable sin of blasphemy to the Holy Spirit. Yes, there is God. He's a great Savior.
So my question would be, if you were to try to convert a pagan who's ready to believe, as C.S. Lewis says, to be converted, what would you say would be safe to present to him who believes in these myths of punishment and almost a purgatory, to present to him that there is, how would you try to convince him that there is, because am I correct in believing, in saying that you believe there is not a purgatory or intermediary realm between heaven and
I speculate there is.
Okay.
There is a purgatory.
Yeah, you make some arguments that say one could be possible to believe in a purgatory. And you say also, I have a question about this. One can argue that there is a period before the final judgment, and yet after, you talk about a sin so severe that there needs to be a punishment. Doesn't the Bible say that all sin is evil because it's all sin against God?
Okay, I think you had two questions there. I'm going to hit your most recent one first. The deal about sin, yes. There is this very real sense in which all sins are equal in the sight of God in that they violate his, because when you think about it, God is love. And all of his rules are ultimately loving. And whenever you have trespassers, well, those are the haters. So, anyway, yes, you run into that issue where they are all the same in that sense. But, there's the interesting topic about how even though there are a variety of sins, we all punish them in different ways. We all have different ways of addressing them. And then there is this blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, and that was the soul sin that I was talking about, where it would seem like there has to be some gap where God does something cool and saves us. I'm sorry. I was just talking about the unforgivable sin. No, that doesn't apply. I'm sorry. For most other sins, except that one. Anyway, yes, that is the one sin that shall never be forgiven according to the Scriptures. But, okay, so that's the second question. Yes, sin is the same, but there's one sin that stands out from all the rest. To get to your first question, I guess it would have to depend on the type of person the pagan was. If they had like a super weak conscience when converting to Christianity, and I don't mean that as an offensive thing, I just mean if they are just very fragile, brittle in whatever you do, you really have to be careful. If that was the case, then I would probably not stress so much on the similarities, and I would try to stress the truth of Christianity in contrast to all those different things, and what stress the truth and then stress the false over here, something like that. I would deal with those people in that way. For the more adventurous soul, I would probably go more like, hey, here are all these things here. And here we can, basically they belong to God in the first place, or at least most of them do, except stuff like, take for example sexual immorality. God doesn't like that, but God does like the body. So no sexual immorality allowed, but body, good. You take those good things, and I think if you showed that sort of pagan how to do that and how that works out logically, I think that would be a good way to deal with that sort of person coming from that. Yes.
So you're saying that there's a possibility that Jesus didn't pay for all of our sins, and there are some certain sins that could possibly have extra purgatory or some punishment that we need to have to fully atone for them and to get into heaven?
Yes, that is a very, very good question there. And I'm familiar with the hymn, Jesus paid it all to him I owe, and all that sort of thing. And yes, there is that sense where indeed Christ has paid it all, but you still run into the issue of, this kind of coincides with the first question I was asked, namely the matter of there being purification or sanctification after we die, right? It kind of goes along with that. And I think the basic idea there is, yes, Jesus has paid for our sins and he has given us forgiveness, but at the same time, at least for a rare amount of people like Enoch and Elijah who just, they're like, great, and God takes them up into heavenly paradise and whatnot. Perhaps for the rest of us, it's kind of more like we're not completely, we haven't completely been absolved of all that wrong. And in that sense, from our perspective, we haven't been cleared of every single wrong thing that we've ever done. And you want to have a follow-up question?
But God isn't looking at us, he's looking at Jesus.
And that's another interesting Christological question we have there. Yes, I would say primarily that God does look at Christ, but there is a sense in which, throughout the Scriptures, saints, even St. Paul talks about how certain Christians' behavior goes as a testimony to God. And so you have this, it might seem paradoxical, but yes, you look at Christ for salvation, but you also look at the people who are being saved by Christ. And in that sense, it's kind of weird to explain, I guess, and it may, I don't know, maybe I'm just completely dumb, but in this sense, there's a peculiar way in which you can look at people who are being saved, and you can see that there is being good, there is good being done in them, even though they aren't completely purified or as great as God. And you can kind of focus your lenses on them in that sense, as that kind of.
Yeah, well, God is purifying us, but it isn't necessary for our salvation.